I'm Terry Ann Wilkie, VP of Corporate Communications for Barksdale Resources. And today we've got a treat. We've got Dr. Peter Megaw, who's with us, world expert on CRD systems, which we do host at Sunnyside and in Arizona. Today, Peter's going to walk us through his presentation on Sunnyside. Peter, make it so that you're talking to somebody brand new that I know nothing about this system whatsoever. And I'll leave it in your good hands, and then we'll go to some Q&A on the back.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here this morning with you, Terry Ann, and I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to talk CRDs and walk people through them and why they matter and why they should care, and obviously within the context of why Barksdale is sitting in the catbird seat as far as the Sunnyside property is concerned.
Sounds good.
So it's worth noting that this is going to be my perception of the upside that the system potentially has based on comparison to carbonate replacement deposits that I've worked on around the world. So it's not going to be a detailed recapitulation of the work that's being done or the background to the drilling that's going on right now. This is what I think the blue sky is for the property. So this morning, I'm going to talk about the Sunnyside Taylor hardshell system and the exploration implications of a remarkably complete porphyry copper scarn to carbonate replacement mineralization spectrum here in southern Arizona. If I turn 90 degrees and could see through the mountain that's in the way from where I live here in Tucson, I could actually see this property. So the Sunnyside property is in southern Arizona, and it's composed in terms of what's known of the Taylor deposit, which is shown here in dark red, and the Sunnyside porphyry right here. So on the right-hand side, we have the detailed zoning of the Taylor part, which goes from silver manganese to silver lead zinc to lead zinc silver copper to copper zinc silver. And then as you transition across into Sunnyside, your copper continues to go up, your zinc goes down. You still have a nice credit for silver. So the Sunnyside porphyry itself is about 800 million tons of 0.175 copper. So not a particularly economic porphyry, but it was drilled out in great detail by a Sarco back in the 60s and 70s. So we actually know a fair amount about the Sunnyside porphyry. So the Sunnyside is the source of the mineralization that worked its way from the porphyry outward through this series of Taylor ore bodies to the hardshell silver manganese deposit. So when we look at Sunnyside Taylor Hermosa in the perspective of the porphyry scarn CRD continuum, we can see that this system behaves extremely well. So we have the intrusive stock. We know where that is. We have the scarn, which is high temperature alteration of the carbonate rocks that surround the porphyry. Where there's carbonate rocks surrounding the porphyry, there's parts around the porphyry and above the porphyry, which are capped by non-reactive rocks. And so the style of mineralization and alteration is different in those rocks. From there, and scarn is just high temperature alteration. That just tells you that you're close to that intrusive center. Outboard from that, things transition into what we call massive sulfides, which means the ore bodies are essentially composed of nothing except sulfide minerals. The ones we care about: sphalerite, galena, chalcopyrite, acanthite, so lead, zinc, silver, copper sulfides with a significant amount of iron pyrite thrown in. And so these form what we call mantos, which are more or less bedding conformable bodies, chimneys which cut across the bedding, and then ultimately where they encounter unreactive rocks on the surface, they form veins. And so we see this transition from the hardshell silver manganese zone, which is way out here and very distal. And historically, the exploration has followed this back in this direction, and this outward in this direction. What we're trying to do is focus on this central zone right here. So essentially, we have these exploration vectors. This is what Arizona Mining and now South32 is following from hard shell through Taylor back toward the source. We're looking at the Sunnyside copper porphyry source, scarns around it, and how that links up to the Taylor body. So there's some nice holes from 1972, so day before yesterday, right? Drilled by a Sarco, led by Fred Graybeal and Fleetwood Couts, both very good geologists. The Porphyry Sunnyside, the Sunnyside Porphyry Center is here, and they drilled hole TCH2/2A right down through here, and they got 17 meters grading 1.3% copper, 12% zinc, and 5% lead from about 1,400 meters drill depth. And then they cut another 38 meters of 0.2% copper with 14% zinc and 0.9% lead from a little bit deeper, 1453. But this is the style of mineralization they got. This is scarn, which means this rock, it looks green because it's mostly composed of green garnets, which is one of the classic indicators of scarn mineralization. So even as far back as 72, Sarco was doing very aggressive deep drilling on the system because they believed in what might occur around the Sunnyside porphyry. So you put this all together into this model, and you have your porphyry center here, which is very complicated as you would expect from a porphyry copper. Multiple stages, a huge breccia associated with it. But what you care about is the high grade shell. And then you have the silver, zinc, lead, copper scarn showing up right here, working its way outward through the Taylor body and ultimately out here to hard shell. And what you see above this is a series of veins in the volcanic rocks that were mined up until the 1960s, primarily by a Sarco small mines division, and they shipped extremely high-grade ore directly to the smelter in El Paso at the time. So these mines were very rich, but they were not carbonate replacement. They were massive sulfide veins. And essentially, the exploration here was driven by following this trend from manganese back towards the source and looking underneath these veins on the surface. Coincidentally, or not coincidentally, but optimally for them, these surface veins all were covered by patented claims dating from the late 1800s. So it gave them an exploration corridor where they could work fairly simply because of the fact that they were on patented ground. I like this system, but I like to think a lot bigger about what else could be in this system. There's no, in my experience, such a thing as a one-armed giant. These big porphyry, CRD, scarn systems have more than one spoke around that porphyry hub. When we look at Bingham Canyon in Utah, which is one of the world's great porphyry copper deposits, sitting here, mined for over 100 years at this point. But what people forget is that what's shown in black here is the CRD demineralization that surrounds this porphyry center like the spokes coming off the hub of an old wagon wheel. These were mined for decades before anybody thought about how to mine this porphyry copper. So these were all high-grade underground silver, lead, zinc mines, produced more than 50 million tons of high-grade ore prior to the development of the Bingham Canyon. So this is our basic model for taking that conceptual model that I showed you a minute ago and showing you a real life example of what a monster looks like And this is admittedly a monster. So if we take that same idea and bring it down to Sunnyside, here's the Sunnyside porphyry. All the geologic indicators are that that is the hub of this system. The Taylor CRD represents a single spoke around that wheel. You don't see that in one of these systems. For me, the big potential is all this ground surrounding it, which has lots of indications that that could be just like the places here where you had those high-level mines that were operated 100 years ago that sit above the Taylor CRD. No one's ever checked any of these other veins that surround this porphyry center. So actually, what you'd like in this system is to find better host rocks around the porphyry. The Taylor Manto is developed up in this part of the sequence. So here are those veins coming through to the surface that they mined in the volcanic, shown by this funny little check pattern. And then this brick pattern, we call it, is the limestone or carbonate rock that hosts the Sunnyside, the Taylor deposit. That's very high in the stratigraphy. That's not the favorable part of the section compared to where Arizona's really big CRDs are developed. And when I'm talking really big, I'm talking about deposits like Bisbee. I'm talking about Morenci. I'm talking about Resolution. These are huge porphyry-centered replacement systems. Now, that's not downplaying the importance of the Taylor deposit. Taylor deposit is really big, despite the fact that the Sunnyside porphyry is not a great porphyry. But what it's saying is that underneath, deeper in the stratigraphy, mineralization below the Taylor may actually be much better than it is in this particular part of the stratigraphy. So the point is, it would be really nice to find mineralization somewhere around Sunnyside developed in those deeper units, but find them closer to the surface. So we're really fortunate in Southern Arizona that not once, but twice, it has been subject to what's called compressional thrusting. So thrusting is just what happens. It's low angle faulting where two continental plates collide, creates massive compression, and the rocks actually slide up on top of each other. So it's like shuffling a deck of cards. And what you want is some of those aces that are the deeper part of the stratigraphy to get shuffled into that upper part where it's closer to the surface. And when you look less than 2 kilometers to the south of Sunnyside, those deeper rocks actually crop out on the surface. So the shuffling has occurred. So we're standing on those rocks right here. This is the Martin Dolomite. It's one of the best host rocks in Arizona. This is the Sunnyside Porphyry complex right back over here. There are structures like this cutting this rock headed straight back toward that porphyry complex. Sunnyside is way back up over here. So if this mineralization like this reflects another Taylor-style manto, this is an entirely separate spoke. This is not, unfortunately, on Barksdale's property. Barksdale's property starts just across this canyon where those volcanics that we see on top of Taylor are masking these same carbonate rocks just on the other side. So what it's telling us here is that the shuffling of the deck that brings the most favorable rocks closer to the surface is there, and we have the same volcanic rocks, which are older than the Sunnyside porphyry, exposed on the surface. So we've got all the right ingredients coming together. So we can look around the Sunnyside porphyry, perhaps over on the west side, across that mountain from where we were just looking, where maybe that deeper part of the section is up close to being underneath these volcanics, where again, we see veins coming through, which we would call leakage from this mineralization down below. So what we did, and this is several years ago, we went out and we sampled all of those fractures. We sampled all the veins, all the fractures we could find, treating them as leakage, because that's how the fluids move through these systems, is along the cracks. So you sample the cracks selectively. The porphyry center sits right about in here. And here's guys out there very carefully selectively sampling those, looking for the leakage. And it's actually pretty obvious in that particular case with those beautiful rust red colors, which is what happens when this sort of thing oxidizes. And when you plot all of those data up, and here's the surface expression of that porphyry center, here's Taylor. Obviously, we couldn't sample on top of Taylor. We didn't own that property. But the continuation of the flux trench zone comes over here, and we see lead and zinc outboard of the copper zone. And on the southwest flank, we see three big anomalies of lead-zinc mineralization, lead-zinc geochemistry, telling us that there is leakage coming up from somewhere. So if we have a monster body here, maybe we have monster bodies here, 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 and here. It fits our model very nicely. So we go back, there we are, Bingham Canyon, that center, maybe that's Taylor, maybe this is stuff that's on the Barksdale property on that southwest flank of that porphyry. So to me, that's the big upside for the system. It follows all the rules in terms of what we expect to see in a big system of this type. It shows the zoning that we expect to see, from manganese to silver to lead to zinc to copper, all the things we expect to see, including in the alteration minerals. So to me, that makes this property really, really exciting.
Well, thank you for that, Peter. It's very interesting to note how the shuffling of the deck and how it can move things closer to surface. Whereas, because the Taylor deposit seems to be quite deep, if there was something higher up, that would make it very interesting.
So one of the interesting aspects that we've learned over the last 2 years with South32 discovering the Peak ore body, which has recently been shown to have extremely high copper grades and really good thicknesses. I mean, I think there's almost 60 meters of 3% copper that's been cut in one of their recent holes, along with almost 3 ounces of silver. So that's pretty tasty mineralization. That's actually developed in that deeper part of the stratigraphy. So the Peak body itself, even though it's practically right next to the Taylor body, is separated from it by a pre-mineral fault that brought more favorable rocks up closer to the surface right there. So that has some really good implications for where things could be going in Sunnyside.
Interesting. So I was hoping to fire off some questions for you and that you can answer if that's okay. I'll just start with, why are CRD systems so interesting to you? What do they potentially offer that other deposits don't?
Well, I've been working with CRDs for 45 years now, something like that. And I got attracted to these things because intellectually they had historically limited interest, despite the fact that they are clearly large, high-grade systems that show, from a geologist standpoint, a fascinating interplay between the process, which is the evolution of that fluid, of a hot fluid that is expelled by a cooling intrusion, and the environment surrounding it, which is this complicated, interbedded series of sedimentary rocks, including reactive carbonates. And I was fascinated by that particular mechanism. And then as I got into them more, recognizing that they form in clusters and they form in belts, and that you can track these regionally. One example is the Arizona-Sonora Porphyry cluster, where a number of the major deposits, Bisbee, Morenci, Resolution, Cananea, all have huge scarn and replacement zones around them. And also, I came up at the time that plate tectonics was just beginning to be really accepted in geology, especially in economic geology. So all of a sudden, we had mechanisms that told us how to understand these systems from a regional standpoint. So that was all intellectually exciting. Practically, as an exploration geologist and economic geologist, it's all about economy. It's supposed to be about finding something that will make money. Yeah. And because these deposits are polymetallic, which is just a fancy word for saying they've got a bunch of different metals in them. So they've got copper, lead, zinc, silver, sometimes gold. And at any given time, one or more of those metals is going to be high. And so you're going to have sustained economic support for the system. So you don't live or die by the copper price or the zinc price or the lead price or the silver price. You're buffered because something's always going to be high. And then throw into that equation the advent of concern about critical metals. And zinc is a critical metal. Silver should be a critical metal. Absolutely. Copper is a critical metal. Manganese is a critical metal. Plus, there's a whole bunch of rarer metals like indium and gallium and tin and tungsten that occur in these deposits that are all critical metals. These all help the economics, but they also help the permitting, and they also help public perception because these deposits make a real contribution to supply security, which has become an increasing concern in today's world. So a combination of intellectual stimulation and practical components makes them very interesting.
So given all these factors, why aren't they more of interest to other companies?
Well, they've become more interesting, but historically, a combination of low prices for silver, lead, and zinc, and copper was king, and the focus for copper was all these huge open pitable copper deposits. Things have changed. We've seen zinc and silver become critical metals. Open pit mining is becoming socially more unpopular. And modern underground mining is highly mechanized and safe, has a much smaller environmental footprint. In fact, if you look at what the neighbors, South32, are talking about, virtually all of their miners are going to be going to work in a building outside Nogales, and they're going to be sitting there working with joysticks, controlling machinery, operating a kilometer or more below the surface by remote control. You don't get much safer than that in terms of what happens to your people. So, these are deposits for the future.
What did Arizona mining do that made the Taylor deposit what it is today? How did they go about finding that?
Well, functionally what they did was connect the dots between the hard shell manganese, which ASARCO had worked on for years, the shallow level lead, zinc, silver veins in the volcanic rocks, and the Sunnyside porphyry. There's conceptual long sections through that belt that go back to the early 70s, drawn by Fred Graybill and Fleet Kautz. Arizona mining went in, followed it, drilled it deeper even than ASARCO had, found it, and continued to track it. So I don't want to, what they did was excellent work. But it was not, it was following a trail of breadcrumbs that was pretty easy to follow. But more broadly, when South32 bought them for $1.3 billion, they completely changed the perspective that the world has on carbonate replacement deposits. You know, personally, I get to say it has changed my life professionally. My phone used to ring once or twice a year with someone asking a question about a CRD. Now it rings 3 or 4 times a week. So that's affected me, but it's also affected the market economically. There's lots of people out looking for these deposits because of the breakthrough represented by the Taylor discovery. So my hat's off to them and to South32 for buying the property. But what Taylor didn't do was they didn't recognize the potential for controlling the whole system. They left a lot more to be found, which pleasantly for us is mostly on Barksdale ground. So they carried the story through one spoke, but didn't recognize the potential for additional spokes. You know, 1.3 billion for a single spoke, that's a pretty good payday. So we think we have 3, maybe 4 more spokes at least that we can see. I'll take the odds on that.
So will I, with a check or 2 or 3. Thank you for that, Peter. So given your extensive experience with CRD deposits and understanding of the Sunnyside project geology, would you say that Barksdale has the extension of the adjacent Taylor deposit that South32 is currently developing?
Well, the short answer is yes. A more complicated answer is that what we know about these systems is that they are characterized by mineralization that is continuous from that source porphyry through the scarn zone to distal CRD. That Asarco drilling that I showed you from the 70s shows, and everything that's known about the district shows very nicely that the Sunnyside porphyry is the center of the system. And Asarco drilled what we would expect the connection between the porphyry and the Taylor deposit to look like right in between. We don't know how much room there is before you bump into the porphyry. It could be 300 meters, could be 500 meters, could be 600 meters. But the location, the zoning, the projection of the Taylor deposit runs smack into that drill hole. So, you know, what I call the root of the Taylor manto, which is whatever there is between the property line and the porphyry, pretty much has to be there. And that's all Barksdale ground.
So CRDs are often associated with economic porphyry deposits. Is this the case at Sunnyside? I know the grades seem to be a bit lower. Does this become interesting later on once, you know, that high grade has been mined? What are your thoughts there?
You know, that's been a big question mark for me for quite a while. Because to me, one of the most revealing and interesting things about the Sunnyside system is that what appears to be an economically weak porphyry copper spawned such a large mineralized body around it. That tells you that, yes, you can make a giant CRD around something like Bingham Canyon, which we know to be a giant porphyry, but it also says that you can make a giant CRD without having a world-class porphyry as the driver. So, you know, that front and center, that says we should be looking at not terribly good porphyries. But in terms of this system, when you look at the amount of copper that appears to be showing up in the peak body, for example, those grades, that suggests that somehow maybe this system had a similar copper budget to a major porphyry, at least to some degree, and that somehow the processes that were acting there transported more of that copper outboard of the porphyry and deposited it in the scarn and replacement zone rather than in the porphyry itself. And that's not entirely unknown. There's plenty of porphyries known where the bulk of mineralization is actually in the shell around the porphyry rather than the porphyry itself. even if you look at some place like Resolution, that mammoth deposit that's just north of Tucson, the high grade bulk of that deposit is all in scarn surrounding the porphyry. So, you know what, we don't know exactly what's going on as far as that's concerned, but this system has giant concentrated bodies known in the South 32 ground, probably in the Barksdale ground. They would all be accessible through whatever that lead, zinc, silver mining infrastructure that South 32 is building will be, you know, that'll all be accessible from that. And again, taking that larger view, ASARCO nailed down the center of the system. We're calling that the hub. And there's good indications for additional spokes around that center. So, you know, not having to think about taking the top off a mountain with all of the social implications of that, or mining the porphyry from underground through block caving or something, and being able to focus on high-grade mineralization, not just the root of the Taylor body, but in additional spokes around it, should be able to keep us busy there for generations. So I don't think we need the porphyry one way or the other.
So South 32's Peak prospect has encountered some exceptionally high grade, as you mentioned, and wide copper intercepts, according to EMX's news release last year in October. Do you think that this prospect extends onto the Barksdale side?
For the same reasons I've talked about in terms of looking for the root of the Taylor, I think the root of the Peak pretty much has to lie in Barksdale ground. When we look at the overall zoning from manganese to silver to lead to zinc to copper, everything is moving in that direction. I think the Peak is richer because it's in more favorable host rocks, like we talked about before. It's not up in the upper part of the sequence where the limestones are thin and there's a lot of sandstone and shale that's not replaceable, that you're down in the pure limestone part of the system. So better host rocks. All the vectors in terms of metal zoning, in terms of geometry, it's all pointed back toward the Sunnyside porphyry. And you can't get from either Taylor or Peak to the Sunnyside porphyry without crossing a significant amount of Barksdale property. So yeah, I think there's a connection.
Well, that's exciting. Are there any other styles of mineralization associated with these types of systems? Or should we simply be focused on the zinc, lead, silver CRD?
Well, as I've said several times, these are polymetallic deposits and they're zoned. And what we're seeing in terms of the Peak and Taylor deposit is that we've got the copper end of that spectrum moving in the direction of Barksdale's property. So that's going to be scarn primarily, which is just high temperature mineralization, high temperature alteration overprinted by the kind of copper, zinc, silver mineralization that we're seeing. Because of this continuum, though, all of the fluids have to travel a considerable distance. I mean, Taylor, the hard shell is about 3 kilometers, maybe 4 kilometers from the edge of the Sunnyside porphyry. And as we mentioned, when you're not in favorable host rocks, when you're in non-reactive rocks like those volcanics or the shales or the sandstones I mentioned, the mineralization is not going to appear as replacement bodies. It's going to appear as veins. And those veins will connect between favorable reactive carbonate units. So those may not be our first choice of targets. They're going to be very high grade. They're going to be high angle, which is a favorable geometry for mining, but they're going to be the links that carry us from one replacement zone to the next. So the short answer is we need to understand the architecture of the system. We need to understand the pathways that the fluids moved from that porphyry outwards. We should expect to see that zoning from copper to zinc to lead with a silver wash over everything. At the most distal end, we could see another manganese silver zone. But as we move our way around the Sunnyside Porphyry Center, we see plenty of those veins coming through to the surface through those volcanic rocks, all of which could reflect leakage from additional replacement mineralization at depth. So we've sampled a bunch of them. There's more work yet to be done around the system, but so far, all the pieces are fitting together of a big, unified, coherent system with many spokes around that hub.
Thank you for that. South32 has committed to spend upwards of $5 billion to develop the world-class Hermosa project. This demonstrates the impressive pedigree of the province to host large-scale base metal deposits. Based on Barksdale's work to date, how significant do you believe the Sunnyside project may be? Do we have a tiger by the tail, or is this just the tip of the iceberg?
Well, I'm going to start by saying I think you have the wrong metaphor, because tigers only have one tail and an iceberg only has one tip. And this type of system has many spokes or many arms.
So how about a daisy?
Daisies work. I like monster octopi better, but that's okay.
I'll take it. They're smart.
Yeah. So again, as much as I like the continuation of the Taylor and Peak deposits, to me, really, it's the potential of those additional spokes that make the real generational upside for Barksdale's part of the system. We've done a lot of work to track them out. We've done geophysics, we've done geochemistry. I'm very eager to see what those results are when we drill.
Oh my. Taylor is already underpinned by a very large resource. So should the deposit's apparent extension onto Sunnyside be of any interest or urgency to South32 given its current depth?
Well, to some degree, that's a corporate question, but I would argue that there's all kinds of reasons why the answer to that question should be yes. Sunnyside porphyry appears to be the source. So, and the rest of the Taylor and Peak bodies almost certainly lie within Barksdale ground. So they need it for that reason, if nothing else. But they should want it sooner rather than later for several reasons. One is mine planning. You don't just change your mine plan at some point because you go, oh, gee, I'd like to mine more, or I need to mine over there. You need to get as much of that planning done up front as possible, because it can cost you a little bit more at the front end to do that, but it costs you like twice as much to do it later. So economically speaking, designing your mine correctly makes all the sense in the world. Obviously, the upside around the system, I mean, why would you settle for one spoke if you could have the whole wheel? Which is the situation they're in. Maybe be generous and say they've got two spokes, assuming that some of that stuff to the south turns into something. And then finally, there's the political advantage of being able to control messaging to the public. You know, from a large company perspective, having other people working in your sandbox can be confusing to the local public. They won't understand why there's two different companies operating there. They won't understand that the companies are different. They'll go, just the miners are over there doing something. We don't like what they're doing. And you don't want to be in a situation where you've committed $5 billion to a project and have somebody else come in and muddy the waters in terms of the local politics. So 3 good reasons for them to want the property.
So South32 bought Arizona Mining for $1.3 billion US at a PEA stage level, it was a all cash transaction. How did South32 go about expanding that resource on the back of that acquisition? And how are they going to expand it even further moving forward?
Well, if you look at what Arizona Mining did, they drilled essentially exclusively from patented ground, which was relatively straightforward. And they drilled they drilled angle holes as far away from the patented ground as they could possibly get. But there are certain limits to geometry of how far you can go from a fixed starting point. So they basically tracked it as far as they could laterally, and they were still getting good mineralization in those holes at the edge of their ability to drill. That's part of what gave South32 the comfort to know that, yes, it was big, but it was potentially a whole lot bigger. So the expansion that they've done has been largely through underground development and drilling from underground, which is a great way to get around the permitting issue, because once you're underground, you can pretty much drill what you want. The downside of drilling from underground is, again, geometrical. You can only drill so far away from your underground workings. The angles only work for so long. So at a certain point, they bump up against the geometric limit of what they can do with drilling, and they bump up against the property boundary with Barksdale. Now, Barksdale took a long time.
Tell me about it.
Some of it was from COVID, but it took a long time to get the permits to do the drilling that we're doing now. And if South32 acquired or made a deal with Barksdale, they could certainly use Barksdale surface permits to drill the extensions of several pieces of what they found.
That makes that permit quite valuable.
Yes, it does. It's worth at least 5 years.
That was a long, painful 5 years, but I was so happy when we did finally get it, and we're currently drilling, so exciting time.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the overall potential of the mineral deposit discovery in the ground held by Barksdale, aka Sunnyside?
Well, if you
We pretty much covered it.
if you haven't been listening, I think that the potential is very high. This system shows all the features of a giant system. I think the root zone to the Taylor Monto is pretty much given, probably for the peak as well. Again, what gets me excited is really the upside for additional spokes around this project. And more Taylors, more peaks, marching all the way around that ore body. I'd love to see it evolve into something like another Bingham Canyon, at least what they call the non-porphyry ores of the Bingham Canyon system.
So if we got something out of this excellent lesson, is Sunnyside Porphyry is the hub. We've got a spoke in the Taylor deposit, possibly another spoke at the Peak prospect. And I think I counted 1, 2, 3 other prospects on the Barksdale ground on that one map that you showed.
At least, yep. So you get a gold star for today, Terry.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Peter. I'm glad we got to repeat a lot of the information, just because it'll help sink in for people. It certainly did sink in for me. And appreciate your time, your expertise, and your passion for Sunnyside.
It's easy. When the system's that good, it's hard not to get excited.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Likewise. Have a good one.